welcome everybody. Welcome to all of our attendees and welcome to our panelists. We're really excited to have you here today to join us for our fourth Geothink and Learn. Today we're going to be talking about the launch of GovEx and Geothink's Open Data Standards Directory. My name is Drew Bush and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at McGill University with Geothink in the Department of Geography here. And the convener for our session today will be Geothink head Renee Sieber, who is also an associate professor in McGill University's Department of Geography and School of Environment. We have a really dynamic panel for you today. Our speakers include Rachel Bloom, who's a project manager of Open Smart Cities in Canada at Open North. We also have Andrew Nicklin, who's the GovEx Director of Data Practices. And GovEx, for those of you who don't know, is located at Johns Hopkins University. We have Nicholas Levy, a McGill University undergraduate student in urban systems and geographic information science. And finally, but definitely not least, we have Julia Konzin, and she will be joining the Employment and Social Development Canada as a data statistical analysis officer this coming January 2018. Before I turn things over to Renee, I just wanted to give all of our attendees a few notes on how you can take part in this session today. In particular, once we've finished each of the presentations, we will have a question and answer session for about 25 to 30 minutes after the end of the session. And there's three ways that you can join us in asking questions or otherwise conversing with our panel. And I would like to just take a quick moment to point those out for you. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see three different buttons. The first that I'll point out is a chat button. On there, you can chat with our panelists and you can chat with other attendees. We ask that you use this for your comments and for your ideas and to respond to what our panelists are talking about, because to ask questions, we would ask that you also instead use the Q&A panel that you'll see down at that bottom, on that bottom bar as well. And so in the Q&A button in the top left, you can add a question for our panel to the queue. One note for everybody who's dialing in today, this whole session will be recorded. So in that Q&A button, if you would like to be anonymous, you can also choose to be anonymous as well. And that way your name won't be recorded. And then finally, there's one last way that you can interact with our panel other than the chat and the Q&A button, and that's by raising your hand. And so when you raise your hand, I'll actually get a message on my end, and I will promote you to share your video and audio, and you can ask your question in person. For those of you who have dialed into our call today, not using a computer or a tablet, I just wanted to point out that you probably won't have access to these options, but we welcome you all the same and encourage you to listen in. And finally, if you're on a tablet, so a smartphone or an iPad or some other type of tablet device, you should have all of these same functionalities, but if you have any trouble with it as you're going through, please just chat to me on the chat and I'll try to help you out. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Renee Sieber, who will be our first speaker, and we'll convene our session with some words about Geothink.
So hello everybody and welcome to Geothink and Learn webinar number 4. And this time I'm really pleased to announce our open data standards for civic governance collaboration with GovEx, and you'll learn more about that during this webinar. So what I'm going to do is just to give you a brief overview of open data standards generally, because it's kind of a wonderful mess. And it might help if we have a little bit of clarifications by what we mean by open data standards. So why do we even talk about open data standards? And I'm referring here to specifically to open government data standards. And often when we talk about this during this webinar, we'll be referring to government as subnational levels of government, states, provinces, cities, and counties. So Open data standards supposedly provides all sorts of wonderful things to governments. It's supposed to ensure interoperability and compatibility among discrete systems. When we talk about discrete systems, the common example is the light bulb. And with few exceptions, when you buy a light bulb, it will screw into any socket that you have in your house or your business. So that's a concrete example of a system. Consistently structured data establishes benchmarks in assessing whether governments achieve their goals in publishing open data. In other words, open data standards could allow us to figure out, well, how are you doing relative to others? How's Chicago doing relative to New York City? How are your contracts doing? You're sending out your RFPs for road constructions, for example. Structuring content is also seen as a way to better ensure accuracy of data. Interoperability enables the use of off-the-shelf software, especially software with user-friendly interfaces like Google. And in fact, that's what we saw with GTFS, the General Transit Feed Specification. When Google originally partnered with TriMet in Portland, Oregon to create the GTFS, the transit standard, the goal for Portland was not merely to create some structure out of its transit data, but also to make use of the user interface that Google was going to provide so that an individual could go to Google Transit and find out when the next bus was going to arrive, or the various connections the individual had to make to get to his or her destination. Standards can also make it easier for third-party developers to create one product that serves multiple locales. And when you look at David Eves's first initiative in trying to create a standard recycling app, his interest was not merely one city, but to reuse that app over and over again. And standards allow that. So for example, also developers other than Google can use these standards like GTFS. So one of the interesting things that happened with GTFS is not only do you have a standard that allows people to create apps on top of it, but it gets, developers can repurpose that data in different ways. For example, looking at regional transit patterns, where previously the data was held by separate transit agencies. Now, presumably standards increase collaboration and data sharing among governments since agencies can more easily understand service gaps and then mesh their services together. So in many ways, open data standards operate as a kind of business intelligence that allows government-to-government data sharing. Standards presumably allow us to open up more data. So it's quite possible that a standard emerges and then a city or a subnational government says, I can use this opportunity to open up this data set that I hadn't opened before. In other words, open data standards may become a precondition for data sharing instead of being applied after the fact. Presumably, open data standards can expose redundancies in data collection. So open data standards may reduce costs. And indeed, Russell and others argue that open data can enable a positive economic feedback loop. So the more open data, more data that you open, the more standards that you apply, the more efficient and effective your government becomes. That causes you to open more data. Okay, wonderful. We're all going to use open data standards, right? So and not only that, we're going to create a single standard, a GTFS for everything. But no, and I bring you to the famous XKCD cartoon. It's a situation, there are 14 competing standards. 14, ridiculous. We need to develop one universal standard that covers everything, everyone's use cases. Yeah, situation. There are 15 competing data standards. So that's kind of the environment that we live in. And hopefully some people will start asking questions in the Q&A about whether we need heterogeneity in our data standards because certain kinds of data sets require less homogeneity than others. So welcome to the word salad of open data standards. One thing that we need to recognize early on is they may all look the same, but they serve different purposes. So predominantly, we'll be talking today about open data standards that ensure or advance interoperability. And when we talk about interoperability, we're really talking about machine-to-machine interoperability, and people will talk about that more, and so will I in a moment. Often people will also talk about open data standards that serve the purpose of performance. In other words, to gauge how complete your open data sets are, how frequently they are updated. And I would be remiss if I didn't include issues of certification and compliance. So in some instances, you may be adopting an open data standard that allows you to both benchmark what you're doing vis-a-vis other cities like an indicator, or that you have to meet some kind of ISO standard. So I'm just going to briefly, I'm just going to briefly say that amongst the word salad, it's also, standards also exist in a stack. And I'm not going to go over this in detail, which will please Drew, who's keeping track of the time. But it's not merely a matter of scoping out these initial justifications and the purposes initially, but there are a whole lot of things that people call standards. They may call them metadata, which is documentation of data sets, which really doesn't apply any kind of structuration, but tells us something about who built it and who owns it. And then there are a whole host of data exchange type of format standards, whether it's UTF-8 for characters, whether it's file formats, or whether it's atomic standards where we start to see some structuration within a data set of the standards. And latitude and longitude is the most commonly used example. We're going to be talking mostly today about schema. So I'm going to let the other people talk about that. But just to let you know that there are a whole host of others, even more structured formats for open data standards so even if we get the schema, there's a whole host of other things that we can do on top of it, including created controlled vocabularies for them and to create permanent links for them to, as Nigel Shadbolt from the UK says, erase the monopoly of government and make data truly open to the people. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to, who am I handing it off to, Drew?
So now we'll be hearing from Rachel Bloom from Open North. Thank you, Renee.
Okay, hi everyone. Just bear with me while I get my slides open. Okay, can everyone see my slides right now? Okay, all right, so today I'll be talking a little more about the project itself, which is the Open Data Standards Directory. I think Professor Sieber really set us up well to kind of talk about open data standards as a concept, but I'm just gonna walk you through kind of how this project started, how it emerged, and the metrics that emerged from a qualitative systematic review of media that was online, and also go into a little bit about research I did after kind of talking to cities about open data standards. So to begin with, the project really began when a partner of Geothink, a city partner, kind of came to Geothink asking about open data standards and wanting more information about open data standards that currently exist, because there's a difficulty of not only choosing what standard to have for your data sets, but also the issue of just knowing what's out there. So that's how it really started. And I think, like Professor Sieber mentioned, GTFS was like a really good example of a standard that was popular, that people perceived the value of, and that it has pretty good documentation about how it came to be. So that was a great resource. But again, we were kind of stuck with the question, well, okay, beyond GTFS, what is an open data standard? So that kind of conceptual foundation was a requirement before moving on to actually cataloging the standards that exist. And I think Professor Sieber went over well what it is, and I don't want to spend more time talking about that. So I think I'm going to move on to the part of getting to the inventory and how that came to be. So we're not interested in kind of just making all data interoperable. We want the data to be useful, and that's why we chose quote unquote like high value data. So these kind of domains of data, such as like annual budgets and building permits and campaign finance contributions, as you can see in the slide. This actually came from work by Yuri Konga from the Open Knowledge Foundation, and he helped identify sets of data sets that were really perceived to be important from a civil society perspective that people want information about. So when I started the project, I chose 10 of these high value data, and you can see in the table there, and that on the right column of the table are the standards that I pulled for the inventory. So this is really the very beginning of what the directory is now. So even though I was finding standards that exist and we kind of came up with a concept, it became very clear when we went back to our partner that when we just handed a list with descriptions, her feedback was, this really isn't very useful. Thank you for telling me what exists, but now the question extends to, well, which one should I use? What should I look out for? So that was definitely a challenge, and I think it was a huge part of what contributes to the value of the directory, and it also kind of had this creative component to it. So the result of, okay, which one do I use, was a set of metrics. And here is just, I won't get into all of them right now. Please feel free to ask questions. But this is kind of what emerged from that question. And like I said, it is informed by a qualitative systematic review. And I did everything from, reading the actual documentation. I read about standards from the perspective of cities, from the perspective of people who wanted to access the data. I also educated myself about like the idea, like the concept of interoperability, open data principles. There's legal characteristics. As you can see, there always needs to be some kind of background information. We don't like to use the word metadata because it's kind of, it might cause confusion in this environment. So we call them a content standard, but basically like the first things that inform your judgment about whether to adopt a technology, such as what's its name, who created it, like what is its stated purpose. So that kind of stuff all fed in to a dashboard format, which is the Open Data Standards Directory today, and that Julia is going to talk to you more about visualizing and that whole challenge. But these are the metrics that emerged from my research. So beyond these set of metrics that were created, I also kind of wanted to know the perspective of cities and kind of validate this whole project with cities themselves who are perceived to be the potential implementers of open data standards. I think it also, like looking back, it would have been actually kind of nice to talk to civil society too, because they generally are the end users of open data standards, but this research was specifically limited to talking to cities. And these cities they're recruited for a survey. And basically the survey structure was, as you can see, informed by diffusion of innovations literature, which is, here you can see Roger's decision process for diffusion of innovations. I won't get into the details of this process, but basically I was trying to figure out, okay, what guides someone to decide to either adopt or reject an open data standard. And as you can see, awareness knowledge is kind of the first part, but then there's also perceived desirable attributes. So that's what I was trying to ask cities about in a way that was understandable to cities, and that was also a struggle. And I was lucky to have great resources such as Geothink and NIST and the Center for Government Excellence, who helped me recruit 13 cities overall to deliver the survey. So these cities were a variety of sizes, so large to small, and within Canada and the United States. So very quickly, just some really top findings from talking to cities. If you can see on the right, we have the count of participants who listed their top 3 reasons to adopt an open data standard. So I was really, thank you, Drew. I was really trying to find out which of kind of the metrics that I created kind of they most strongly signal to potential implementers of standards their value. So as you can see, most people are really attracted to standards that are highly adopted and are popular. So if they perceive other cities to use a standard, it's a big signal for them that it's a desirable standard. In addition, as Professor Sieber pointed out, it's really hard to talk about open data standards. From talking to cities, we determined that the term open data standard can refer to metadata, file formats, schema, vocabularies, metrics and rating systems. All of those kind of can fall under the term open data standard. So it took a while just to kind of parse out, okay, I'm asking you about this and I want to talk about this, but you might, based on your preconception, you might have a different way of thinking about it. So I think I'll leave it at that because I'm out of time, but if you have any questions, I mean, we'll have a question period, so I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And our next speaker will be Andrew Nicklin from the Center for Government Excellence, known as GovEx, at Johns Hopkins University.
Well, hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. And thanks to Geothink for hosting this. So I work out of Baltimore. I live in New York, and that means that I deal with data from a lot of different places just in my normal daily life, transit being a significant part of that. And one of the things that we do here at GovEx is we work with cities across the United States and actually a few around the globe on helping them deploy open data, helping them make their data publicly accessible. And it's a very routine question that we would get would be, well, okay, now that we know we want to make permits data publicly available, how should we do that? What's the best information? What are the details of the permits that we should be making publicly accessible? And so through our work with all of these cities, we were seeing a consistent pattern of people not knowing how to do this. And it turns out this isn't something you can Google. You can't just type into Google, hey, tell me what fields I should include in a permits data set. It's just not possible to find that. And so I started thinking about the concept of civic data standards and this idea that many governments and many open data publishers, who are not just governments, but many open data publishers need a place to go where they can find a list of these resources, find a list of these various standards that are out there. And so I had started actually putting something together on my own, and I published a piece about civic data standards and said, look, this is what I think a civic data standard is. I think it's something that is kind of done out in the open and collaboratively, and is something that has like at least a couple of publishers and at least a couple of data consumers as part of the conversation who are all collaborating together. And they have kind of agreed on like how data should be flowing between them. And they would ideally also allow other people to enter that conversation. And that gives us like the ability, that gives each standard the ability to scale. So I did a little bit of digging on my own, did some homework on that, and then happened to be at a conference. I think it was probably the International Open Data Conference or the Open Government Partnership or one of those. Was talking about it with somebody on the side, and they said, hey, have you spoken to Rachel Bloom? And I said, no, I don't even know who Rachel is, but I would love to speak with her. And so I sent this kind of like out of the blue, crazy email to Rachel saying, hey, I've heard you're working on some stuff. I actually didn't even know, Rachel, that you were a student at the time. And so, you know, we were able to get connected, and I'm very grateful for that connection. It was, and it really helped us kind of propel this forwards. And then very quickly after that, I was introduced to Renee, and we were able to build this partnership. And I think the key to it was, you know, Rachel had done something very important, which is created a framework for how to identify a list of standards and how to have metrics around each one of them, how to provide some sort of details around each one of them that might help people in their decision making. Because as Renee pointed out in the beginning, sometimes there are 14 standards for something, and you don't want to necessarily go out and create a 15th standard. There might be one of the 14 that can work for you. But again, going back to this problem of like the stuff not being searchable on the internet, how do you figure those out? Like, how do you find all of those 14 and then find which one is the right one? There wasn't a way to do that. And so with all the research that Rachel had been doing and all the thinking that we'd been doing in terms of our work with cities, it seemed like a great opportunity to partner. And so we were able to get together and start thinking about building an actual website for this. So you can find it at datastandards.directory on the internet. We originally populated with the 20 or 25 standards that Rachel researched, and then expanded that to now something like 60 or so, thanks to a lot of work from Julia and Nick. I'm seeing more than 60, or is that just a thumbs up because we got that far? Around 70, yeah. So that's huge, right? I mean, so, and I think we're just tapping the, we're just hitting the tip of the iceberg on standards. There are lots of standard organizations, and part of the thing that we need to figure out is how to thread all of the existing work that's happening other places, you know, through the Internet Engineering Task Force, the International Standards Organization, through the World Wide Web Consortium. There's a whole series of other places where standards are actually being pulled together. And we need to figure out a way to make that all sort of readily accessible and available in a directory. But what we have for now is this list of 70 that are out in the open, that are fairly easy to become a part of the community, and all the details about them, like their licensing and so on. And for us, this fits a problem that we've been trying to solve with the cities that we work with. It seemed like it's the first place we've been sort of touting in the press releases and so on that it's the first global international site of its kind, and so far the evidence of that seems to be true. And you know, what I would say is that this is going to be a continuing work in progress. We're not going to rest here. We have 70. There are lots more to add. There are opportunities for everybody who is, who's enjoying this webinar today to participate, either through, if you have standards that you know about that are not a part of the site, you can add them. And if you actually want to contribute to the source code to the site, it's open source, and we will happily take improvements because we think that there's a lot of work to do. I just want to mention a little bit about a roadmap. There's a lot of, I think, forward thinking about this that has to happen in terms of like where we can take this. And so I've been in the process of developing a roadmap and sharing it with some of my closer colleagues. Then we'll be expanding it out to the broader community for feedback, because obviously it doesn't make sense just to have a roadmap that nobody else has bought into. So as we get a little bit closer to making that accessible and ready for comment, we'll let folks know. But I'm really excited to see where this goes. And I would also point out that there are some other complementary work that goes along with this that's really valuable. And that's things like, what are the best ways to actually create standards in the first place? And so there are folks, who are thinking about that pretty intensely. I think there might not be one answer to that question, but I think there's going to be, sort of a number of different paths in which you can arrive at a standard. And one of the things that we'd like to be able to do is maybe create the foundation for, if you're in this situation, this might be the right path. So if you were just like a collection of civil service society organizations, or non-government organizations, and you're working with a couple of governments, maybe you just form a small partnership. But maybe if you are sort of a number of large internet firms, you're going to work with W3C or ISO or something like that, because there's a sort of a mechanism for collaboration that they have built into their process. Anyway, so I will stop there. I think there's probably a ton more that I could talk about, but I would just sort of double down on what Renee said at the beginning, that standards are incredibly important. I think the light bulb metaphor is exactly right. And the problem is that we have 2,000 or so portals, open data portals across the globe, each of which has hundreds or thousands of data sets on it. And very few of those, and it would be interesting to measure this, but the percentage of them that are actually aligned to standards is probably below 1%. So we have a lot of work cut out ahead of us. But if we can make a dent in that, I think we can make a real difference in how open data scales and how it can be used and how it can make an economic impact in the world. So thanks.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And now we'll be hearing from Julia Konzen.
Hi, everyone. Just give me a second here. I'm gonna set up the PowerPoint. So yeah, my name is Julia Konzen. My work for the Open Data Standards Project was a research assistant helping out Rachel with conducting some surveys, and as well as developing a visualization prototype and helping develop the data standards directory itself. So basically, here's just a little timeline of how we went about developing the visualization. We started off with Rachel's research data as a spreadsheet. She showed a screenshot. I'll show you one in the next slide. We then had some discussions with our partner and other individuals that we believe would be using visualization. And then we went and developed the prototype, then with additional feedback and with Rachel's final kind of research, as well as additional user experience research, we went and then developed the Open Data Standards Directory that you can see today. And then once that I'm done kind of giving you a timeline, I'm then going to kind of show you how you can navigate through the Data Standard Directory. So this is Rachel's original research data. It came out as a spreadsheet, and it was awesome that it existed because there is a value for this information, but some of our users found it rather difficult to kind of navigate through the information. And so there was this need for a visualization and a way for users to kind of interact with maybe like a web page so that they can kind of access the information that's most valuable to them. So with that in mind, before we started kind of developing the actual prototype, we wanted to kind of narrow down on the type of users that would be accessing this information. And we came down to kind of three main ones, which was municipal open data publishers, open data standard providers and creators, and then the site supporters. For municipal open data publishers, we really wanted to make sure that they could find and search the data seamlessly, whether it be by the name of the standard if they knew of a specific standard, or by the category of standard, for instance, real-time transit, if that was the type of data that they were working with. We wanted to visualize the metrics that Rachel created as both icons, so it's easy for people to kind of scan through it if they're familiar with the site, or as text as well for additional information, and for those people that might not be familiar with what the icons represent. And we also wanted them to kind of be part of the community, contribute information, add a standard, update a standard, kind of follow the discourse regarding open data standards for municipalities. And then for the open data standard providers and creators, we wanted them to have the ability to add their own standard to the database, as well as update the standard that they work with. And then, of course, we want site supporters, people to verify the crowdsourced information and maintain the site, and further expand the site to add additional features to it. And so once we kind of came up with these personas, we went about and developed a prototype, which you can kind of see in this little clip here. But basically, there was a drop-down menu. You could select the category that you kind of worked within, and then you would get a list of all the standards that existed. You could update the standard, you could add another standard to that category, you could hover over those metrics, and you would get additional information as to why it was valued that way. We kind of followed a similar visualization for the metrics as what you can see in Open Knowledge's Global Open Data Index. And what was unique to this visualization as well is, based off some of Rachel's research, we kind of did a comparison across Canadian municipalities on how they released some of the data sets and whether it was standardized or not. So we kind of shared this prototype with some of our potential users, and they expressed gratitude for its existence, but they also kind of gave some suggestions on how we could kind of scale this larger and really develop a full-fledged site for this. And fortunately, Andrew was excited to jump on board, and we got to get to work with GovEx on developing a full site. So this is just kind of a glance of how the site is developed, but basically with Rachel's spreadsheet, we migrated it into a cloud database and then developed an API so people could query the database and access information that was most suitable for them. And then we went ahead and developed a web app, which is known as the Data Standard Directory, where you can actually use the interface to kind of query that database and access the information that is most valuable to you. So don't be overwhelmed too much by this, but the focus is at the top in that URL. You see datastandards.directory/API/getAll. And in that case, your browser will show every single standard that is within the database as a JSON format. But let's say you don't want all the standards, maybe you just work with election data. You can check out which standards exist for election data by, instead of doing get/all, you do get/election, and it will query any standard that exists that has election in its name, and if it has election as a category. And then, so now we have the Open Data Standards Directory, and I'm just going to open it up and I'm going to give you a little preview of how you can actually interact with the web app. So basically, if you know of a specific standard and you want to get information about it, all you have to do is type in, so as we keep talking about GTFS, so if you click GTFS, you'll see the standard exist. On the top right corner, you have the tags associated with that standard. Here's the name of the standard. Here's the provider of that standard. You can share the standard. You also have the metrics here, but if you hover over, you can get additional information. You have when it was published, when it was updated in the directory, the version of the standard, a quick description of it, but further additional information here, as well as the people that are using the standard. You can also click on website. You can go to the website, the documentation, examples, and you can update the standard if you believe it's updated. You can also you can search by category if that's more of an interest to you. So for instance, if I click transportation, my search results will show every standard that is associated with transportation. You can sort them, and based off of actual feedback we received from Rachel's research is that people wanted to see the standards, sort standards based off of the one that is most used. So if you click that, it shows you that GTFS is the most used. And I'll let Nick detail more, but there's also a category section to quickly kind of search through standards based off categories and subcategories as well. But yeah, that's all on my end. I just pull up my slide. Here's my contact information, so feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And our final speaker will be Nicholas Levy.
Thank you, Julia. Share screen, here we go. Yeah, I'm glad that you left off talking about categories because I'm going to talk to you about why we would need to classify these open data standards, especially as our directory grows. It kind of occurred to me as I was adding more standards to the directory this summer that our categories, it was hard to fit everything in this list of categories that we already had, you know, especially the high value categories that Rachel mentioned, real-time transit, building permits, because there's also all this variation within data standards that Professor Sieber got into. You know, is it an atomic standard? Is it just a data format, or is it specifying just header names and file names for a CSV? Really the idea of classification, or one purpose is so as this directory grows, it can improve the discoverability for, say, municipal data publisher to find the right standard for them. So there are different kinds of classification systems. Here we have kind of a spectrum where we have the most structured on the right, we have ontologies, and then controlled vocabularies in the middle, and then folksonomies to the left. And I took a look at all three of those when deciding what to do for the directory, and quite quickly decided against using an ontology because it is so structured that anyone who wants to, say, contribute to the directory and classify their own classified data standards would have to have an intimate knowledge of the ontology to do so. And there's a strict hierarchy, and especially these classifications, or an ontology is exclusive. So it doesn't really fit with what I'm going to talk about. Folksonomy, on the other hand, is a loose classification system. It's just using a system of tags. It's kind of what you could see in the directory now. We just have categories and subcategories. But the idea of a folksonomy is that any user is allowed to add a tag. So on Flickr or on Instagram with hashtags. And there's a little structure to those tags, and an object can be associated with as many tags as users want. And so because there's no structure, there's often little meaning, and you end up with little meaning to tags, and you end up with what's known as a long tail, where there might be a lot of tags that mean the same thing, but because they're not used for the same thing, they are forgotten about from disuse. So I decided to go with controlled vocabulary using something called facets. So an example of these is, if you search for something on Amazon, here I search for cell phone, and I end up with all these choices for narrowing down my search options. And that means that all the phones in this list are associated with a phone color. It could be multiple colors, that's not exclusive, or cell phone features. It can have multiple of those features. These are non-exclusive tags. Having a controlled vocabulary, meaning a user can't just add any old text as a tag, means that it cuts off the long tail. So if users are allowed to select from a set of tags, those tags get used more often, and then there's less redundancy, I guess. This right now is hasn't been implemented in the directory yet, but I do kind of show an example of what a facet vocabulary for open data standards might look like. So to the left, this is just an example of I would say fairly good looking folksonomic tags for, I just chose the Open 311 GeoReport API, which is in the directory. But these could be, there could be a whole string of text before it. Like, you could write, works well in North America, or used all over North America, not just North America. And now to the right is a more structured version of this classification with a facet. And it conveys much more information to the reader. So, if I see that, I see that there are multiple options for the serialization of this data standard. And that municipal governments might be a publisher of the standard rather than a consumer. And of course, not all of these tags fit into facets. So going forward, an example of an interface for searching a directory, like a faceted search for querying the directory, would be a filtered search, kind of like on Amazon. And it would also include those binary metrics that that Rachel talked about earlier, so which we have visualized here even. I kind of just made a little example of what this interface would look like, but if standards had these faceted tags associated with them, they would also be visualized in place of just our simple category names now. So if you look on the bottom right, I have things like ontology or API, which don't really fit into, it's not a category, it's not a serialization format, but with API, for example, some of these standards in the directories they're framed as an API for a government to provide to their constituents. Out of this, whole complicated mess of classifying open data standards, this classification, this faceted keyword system, I think can kind of cut out a lot of the, a lot of the confusion and difficulty in, discovering open data standards. And, I can't click through. Thank you all.
Great, thank you, Nick. So now we have about 30 minutes till 1:15 to open this session to questions from our attendees. Just to quickly remind everybody how you might ask questions, there are 3 ways you can go about it. At the top of your screen, you'll see a button for Q&A. You can both write Q&A questions under the name that you logged into Zoom with. You can also as well write them anonymously if you'd like to there. The other option you have for asking questions is you'll see a button that allows you to raise your hand, in which case I can promote you to share your video and audio and you can ask your questions directly. And then finally, as you all probably already noticed, we have a pretty robust discussion going on in our chat box, so feel free to tune in there. And I think to start off our Q&A session, I wanted to pose one of the questions that's already been asked in our written Q&A. Renee has already answered this, but I wanted to give all of our panelists a chance to take a moment to answer it and to give us a sense of how we locate this project in sort of the big picture. So the question is, are the presenters aware of other directories for different sectors, i.e. beyond data used by cities, and is there a directory of directories? So I know Renee already answered this, but I'll let everybody take a moment to locate this project.
I'll take a stab if that's all right. So I think I agree with Renee. There's not something evident. ISO, the International Standards Organization, is interesting because they don't necessarily, they are an organization that specializes in dealing with standards. And so those come in a variety of forms, such as like what kind of socket should you have for your light bulbs, as well as what are the best ways to do project management, to what are the indicators that cities should be making available so that they can be compared across the globe in terms of their overall development. So they have a vast array. And as Renee pointed out, like ISO in particular, none of the standards that I know of on there are actually available openly and for free. And so getting involved in collaborating with them or even just getting access to them, there's a little bit of a barrier to that. In the United States, there's also NIST, which is a federal agency that has some involvement in thinking through standards and picking out which ones should be adopted by the U.S. government and then also potentially by U.S. states and localities. And there are a few others, such as the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, the Internet Engineering Task Force, and even search engines have gotten together and worked on schema.org, which is basically a way, a site with a set of standards for how to tag content on your site so that it improves your content's discoverability. But there isn't really, as far as we know, a directory of directories, as the asker put it. I do think that would be interesting at some point to think through. But I think the challenge that we would face there is, like, with ISO, ISO has lots of standards for lots of different types of things, ranging from physical things that are in your hands to processes that you do. And so, I think we'd have to be a little bit more careful about how, we'd have to think about like how to tag all of that stuff and represent it effectively in a directory like that.
I'll add to Andrew's comment that if you think back to the standard stack, a lot of work that's done in standards is generic to all domains. So it can be quite difficult for a city that has a public works department. It's like, well, okay, you're telling me about linked open data, but how do I actually apply it to public works? Or how do I apply it to service delivery? So there's a bit of a disconnect between the gold standard of creating a standard and the application of a standard.
Thank you, Andrew and Renee. Did any of our other panelists want to add to that? Okay, and I'm going to move on to another question then from our Q&A session here, and perhaps add to it. So one of our attendees asks, what are some potential risks of increasing interoperability for open data? And I would add, since the attendee has asked about risks, what are some of the benefits, which I know have been talked about in a number of these presentations?
So I guess I can speak to that question. I now work on a project that focuses on smart cities, and smart cities are almost synonymous with Internet of Things, and that heavily relies on interoperability, and definitely interoperability and connectivity. That kind of terminology is really commonly applied. So there are a lot of risks associated with interoperability. I think the most voiced one is probably privacy concerns, right? So the idea that private or personal data will be shared widely. There's also issues of security. There's also issues of just ownership of the data and keeping track of the data. So I think there are a lot of risks that typically, when you talk about smartness or automation, stuff like that, typically they don't get addressed, even though there's lots of groups that do address these issues. Typically, connectivity is promoted kind of as a goal among big proponents of smart city initiatives. So that's my experience with that, and that's what comes to mind when I think about the risks.
And standards is also, sorry, Andrew. Standards is also an act of homogenization, and someone had asked a question about that earlier that I answered, and not all governments work the same, but when you standardize data, when you try to fit it between two tags as you would in a schema, you're taking a lot of the nuance out of the data. Now, that may be fine for machine readability. That's not so fine when the end user is trying to uncover a malfeasance and says, aha, they spent twice as much on this as this other city, therefore there's malfeasance going on. Because you just have the data element without any other context, you can ascribe motivations that or activities that merely don't exist. So that is a real challenge for us in terms of interoperability, is to create sufficient nuance. And Nick touched a little bit on ontologies, but the reason that we don't do ontologies is because they are complete encapsulations of a phenomenon. What do I mean by that? That means that if you're going to define what a road is, you have to create the definition of a road that encompasses every single road in the world, for example, and distinguishes a road from a parking lot, distinguishes a road from a path. That's very, very heavy. That's one way that you get both the semantic understanding and you get the greater nuance. But that is so top heavy that people generally rely on schema, and there's a great challenge when we're dealing with data elements and not what the data means.
And Andrew, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add a small comment about sensitive information and privacy. And if we're talking about standards in a global context, one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that privacy is actually very different in different parts of the globe. And so if we are encouraging the use of a homogeneous standard for a particular type of data globally, we run the risk of, while protecting privacy in one place, exposing it somewhere else. And so I think that's one area where standards present interesting risks. I'm not entirely sure that we'll ever get to a point, at least in the near future, where we will have a homogeneous standard for something that is completely global. So that's probably a far-reaching thing. But I think the idea of just that expectations of privacy and expectations of protected information are actually a little bit different between places. And so that pattern needs to be thought through when it comes to adoption of standards too.
Thank you, Andrew, and to all the panelists who answered that question. Our next question also comes from the written Q&A, but I know we have a couple people who are dialed in on telephone, so they can't necessarily see these questions. And this one is specific, I believe, for Rachel. They're asking about the research that you did to initiate this project, and in particular, what were the type of people you talked with within some of these cities, and what kinds of conversations and how did those inform the project?
So typically I spoke to open data leads when they were available. Smaller cities might not have full-time employees for their open data program. So in those cases, I talked to the person looking into adopting standards for open data. So there was a variety of titles in those cases. I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question? The types of conversations I had?
So the types of conversations and how that informed the initiation of this project.
Right. So maybe I wasn't clear, but definitely talking to cities happened after the set of metrics had already been formulated. So it was kind of like a validation process with cities, and also getting a feel for kind of if there was a need for this directory. I mean, we clearly felt that there was, and it came from interest from a partner city of Geothink, but we just wanted to see if kind of assumptions we had made down the road, we wanted to validate with cities. So that was kind of an important step. And just get some feedback. I think after every survey that was delivered, and it was a very structured survey, unfortunately, so I wasn't able to have like a free-form discussion. But I think after every survey that was delivered, Julia would follow up, introducing the directory and asking for feedback about the visualization and the metrics. So yeah.
Cool, great. So I just want to remind all of our attendees at this point that now is a good time to pose your questions if you have them. So feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to pose one to our panelists live. You could also feel free to pose them in our Q&A section, and as you've seen, I will ask some of them. We actually just had a new question coming in from another attendee asking, what is an example of a global standard? And I assume what's implicit here is, does such a thing exist?
I'm typing, typing an answer as we speak. The National Census Bureaus. They have meetings every year to create global standards for demographics. And as I mentioned in the chat, and I'll finish typing in the text, even they have tremendous difficulty. Think of a global standard for what a family is, what a household is, varies widely, even as they do attempt to create cross-country standards for family, income, what a job is, but it's still a global standard.
Other thoughts on what constitutes a global standard from folks on the panel?
I would say where there are things that correspond to human activities that we almost universally do. So, I mean, we were talking about GTFS a lot, and GTFS might itself not be a global open data standard, although it does have very broad adoption. But the idea that there are large numbers of people all across the globe who take public transit, that's a behavior that many of us engage in, and therefore data about public transit, such as like where the places are where you can access it or when it's likely to show up, are all things that we are all likely to need to know. And so while GTFS itself might not be a global standard, in fact, there are some competing ones, the concept of having public transit open data, I think, is certainly a global one. I think the other challenge that comes with global standards is really around language. And, you know, this is something that I know some of the cities that I've worked with here in the US really want to focus on bilingual access to data, particularly in Spanish and in English. And I would imagine in Canada it's probably similar, but with French, where even though the content on their websites and the descriptions about things are all bilingual, the data itself is not. And so it's a real challenge to figure out sort of how do you take structured data that may be in one language, and is there a way for you actually to make it reliably available in a second or a third language? It's a really interesting challenge to solve. But also speaks to the question of, like, you know, one of the sort of significant problems with globalization as a whole. And not problem in a bad way, it's like something that would be good to solve.
I also want to address, and it doesn't come up a lot, but semantic interoperability. When we talk about standards, we often talk about only two user groups. We talk about the people who force fit the data into a standard, and then we talk about ultimate end users, whether they're people using a transit app or they're checking building permits. We often don't talk about the city as user. And one of the challenges of open data standards is making them understandable to the people who are working in those offices. And we've seen this problem emerge with the International Aid Transparency Initiative standard. So this is a supposedly global standard for international aid agencies. Many of the partners are actually countries, as well as charity organizations. And you go to a conference and almost immediately there's this great divide between the developers and between the policymakers, who can't really understand the internals of the schema. So it's in addition to the bilingualism. So bilingualism is an issue not merely for the end user, but also for needs for bilingualism with the tags and with the content between the tags internally in a government.
Thank you. I think we answered that question pretty well. We have another question coming in from our attendees, and this one is specific to Julia, although I believe, Nicholas, perhaps you might want to answer this one as well. It asks, this is a research methods question for those of us researching data standards visualization. Specifically, what are some of the challenges to visualization from your experience in this project?
I think the main one was visualizing the metrics initially, because we wanted to first have icons, but then we go, what icons are associated with each metric, and how can we assume or understand, make sure people understand those icons are associated with which metrics. But we also wanted to make sure there was people had the ability to not just interpret the metrics just as a yes, no, or it was maybe or unsure. So we wanted to make sure there was the ability to, you know, hover over each metric and get further information for it. Trying to think if was there any other apparent difficulties? Rachel, do you recall from at the beginning?
I mean, for just when I was like creating the inventory in the first place, it was really hard just to categorize things as binary, yes or no. And I mean, the dashboard idea was like it was a direct recommendation from a city. I don't think I would have ever thought of that approach otherwise, because standards are extremely complex, and I thought it would be too difficult to capture that information in a dashboard view. But I mean, clearly you did a great job, so I'm really impressed that it worked out.
Yeah, we definitely were inspired by Open Knowledge's Global Open Data Index. That kind of gave inspiration for how to visualize those metrics. Nick, do you have anything else to say about it?
You were great with the red and the green. They really drove that home. Yeah, in terms of visualization, there were, it's kind of hard to pinpoint, you know, what inspiration was, rather than just, I don't know, I wanted to see, I was trying to see what are the most important pieces of information about a standard. And I know at first we just had the title of the standard, and then the name of the publisher was somewhere in because there's a whole block of text that goes underneath the line of metrics. So one thing that I think improved, I don't know, usability was throwing the name of the publisher on top, and also one of the metrics is level of use, which when Rachel did her original research, it was sometimes like a list of cities that employ this data standard. Sometimes it was just a lot of cities in this region use this, or it's popular in Europe, and sometimes it's you know, used by, so to supplement that, and also for the purpose of being able to organize a search list by, you know, because I think a lot of cities need to know what is the standard with the most publishers. So I, for as many standards as I could, try to find lists of publishers, and then put them in their own field and quantify them, so you can actually organize, you can see the list of the users, and then sort by the number. It's been hard. Unfortunately, a lot of standards don't keep track of who are using the standards, as is the nature of an open data standard with an open license. So yeah, some challenges there.
Just want to add one last thing. Just in general, the whole process of developing the directory was very dynamic, where, you know, we developed a prototype, we shared it amongst what we believe would be our users, and we received a lot of feedback, and then we adjusted, you know, the design and the development based off of the continuous feedback we received over time. And we really wanted to make sure that this directory would be accessible for, you know, municipal open data publishers, so they can navigate easily through to see the standards that exist. But we also wanted to make sure, you know, the open data standard producers, providers could also have a quick way to add their standard onto it, or make sure that they can observe their standard and see that the information that's populating it is accurate.
Thank you, Julia. And I think we have time for maybe just one more question. And I think I'll take the opportunity to ask one that I think Julia's comments lead into. And so in particular, I noted in Rachel's presentation that this whole project began actually because of a query from one of Geothink's municipal partners, so one of our city partners. And I wanted to ask each of our panelists, seeing how this project has developed and now with the launch of the directory itself, I'm wondering what you think a city that comes to this directory would get from it in this evolution of where the directory is now, and what they might see in it, say 5 or maybe even 10 years from now, if they were to come and want to use this directory.
I can mention, I think this was something that Andrew expressed that he would like to see in the site at some point, but maybe we could have an automated way to get the information off open data standard providers and have it populate into the database automatically. And that way, we don't have to have these standard providers kind of moderating what information is associated with them in the site. Instead, it just would be automatically appear on there based off what they publish on their own site, for instance. Hopefully also just more open data standards will be in the directory as well, and especially which municipalities are using those open data standards, because that seems to be a valuable piece of information that a lot of open data publishers want to see accessible based off of what Rachel's research said.
I'd answer it in 2 ways. I hope that, there's an interesting tension at the moment in who gets to develop the standards, and whether the standards are developed by cities, by governments, or whether they're developed by private sector actors who say, if you want to use our service, then you have to standardize your data. So there's an important issue going forward about the role of domain experts and governments in the development of these standards. Second of all, I'd flip your question a bit, Drew, and I would suggest that one of the things that cities can get out of an inventory like this is what they contribute to the inventory. This is a live inventory. This is not merely, this is certainly a resource for cities, but we're hoping that cities, that governments will add to the inventory itself, whether or not they add completely new standards, whether they add new metrics to the standards, or whether they talk about the level of adoption of these standards. It remains an open question about how much of government data will be standardized at all in the future. We never used to think of data as an output of government. I am not convinced yet whether that's still a good idea. Data was always a means to an end for good decision making. So there may be in the near future more reflection on, so what is this data actually good for? Hopefully our inventory and our metrics will help cities try to get a handle on that, but we need to have more meaningful conversations about what's meaningful about these this quote unquote raw data that's coming out of cities.
I think I would also like to add that I think it provides a great platform to think critically about technology, especially as more automation occurs. I think one of the great takeaways of this framework is that now people they have a guide to think critically about the technology they are looking to adopt, and they don't have to just accept it blindly. They can really have a way to think critically. So I think it's educational on both sides. I mean, I learned a lot from cities also, and that fed into the metrics themselves. And I think we're also providing a way to think about this technology in a critical manner.
So thank you, everyone. I think we're just about at our time limit. So I just had a couple quick notes before I turn it over to our session convener, Renee Sieber, for her final thoughts on today's webinar. First notes I had for folks is that this entire webinar will be recorded and shared on geothink.ca. So definitely visit our website and refer your friends if they missed the webinar and would like to see what we talked about. Of course, make sure you check out the directory at datastandards.directory. As you heard today, we're looking for your contributions, and we would, of course, appreciate your feedback. I wanted to also take an opportunity to plug our next Geothink and Learn. That will be in January, on Friday, January 26th, and it will be on the data of social justice. It will be convened by Geothink co-applicant John Corbett from UBC Okanagan. And finally, I wanted to thank you all for joining us over your lunch break. And now I'd like to turn it over to Geothink head Renee Sieber for her final concluding thoughts.
Standards are often thought about as really boring. And I have a suspicion that the undergraduates were really skeptical when I asked them to get involved in a project like that. But they do turn out to be the interoperable glue that are going to join a lot of governments together for better, or for worse, or for something in between. In many ways, standards are their most powerful when they shift into the background. They become the infrastructure of our lives. So I think it's important for us to have a deliberative engagement with them now, and hopefully we always try to foreground them a little bit and ask what they're doing for us and what they're doing to us.
Thank you, Renee, and thank you to everybody for joining us today, and thank you especially to our panelists. It was an insightful and dynamic discussion, and we appreciate having you here today. Thanks, everyone.